everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the virtual classroom to talk and learn more about cannabis. My name is Dr. Shonda Macias, and I'm a multi state operator. Previously in my life, though, I was a biomedical researcher with the MBA. And so pivoting my way into cannabis through operations was just a natural fit. So today I've been in the industry for many years, and I wanted to share some of the education that I've developed throughout those years. And I know that in this series of virtual classrooms, we're going to talk a lot about cannabis, but as it pertains to different subjects. So if you think about an alternate aspect of opioid usage, we'll have a discussion of that. We'll talk about how it works and what forms work best for different patients. We'll talk about cannabis as it relates to autism, COVID 19. Cannabis and sex is a big one, and also parenthood. And so we look excited to really to bring all this knowledge to you the best way we can. Now, today's topic though is cannabis legalization. And I have the amazing Safira Galub to talk about it. She's a federal lobbyist, and also she runs the National Cannabis Roundtable. Safira, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be not just a part of this conversation, but this really integral and crucial kind of conveyance of information that you're giving to our communities and to the nation on this amazing plant that's going to be a part of all of our futures.
One thing is that when I work with my patients, just day to day, I like to talk about subjects as it relates to them and as well as it relates to government. So when we think about government, we really focus on state and federal government. But one of the questions my patients always ask me is that, can I possess cannabis? And if so, where can I possess it? Can you talk about what states are legalized?
Yes, and I think when we think about the construct of legalization, it's not a one size fits all answer. So I want to talk about four different types of markets when we think about legalization. The first is the most open market, which is what we call adult use or adult consumption. And so in those markets, those are the types of laws that allow access to cannabis by folks who are adults, much like you'd be able to access or purchase alcohol. Then we have medical markets, and those markets are states that have passed laws that allow patients and consumers to access medicine through caregivers, and that caregiver or that medical provider or the individual who's been designated by the state to allow patients to access medicine. I'm sure you'll get into that a little more later. But then we also have markets that are decriminalized, where they don't necessarily have a commercial market, but you can possess cannabis without fear of going to be incarcerated or to be prosecuted. And then there are still a couple of illegal markets, which I think we're getting really close to being able to wipe out, and that being no longer, hopefully in the next several say months, or at least in a year or so. So at least it will be decriminalized throughout the state. So I hope that's a helpful description to start with.
Well, it definitely is. I think that when the patients always have questions, it's about will I go to jail if I have cannabis? And the answer to that would be really, it just depends. It depends where you are located, what are your state laws, and what that looks like. So you have two extremes almost. You have the legalized market or the adult use market, also known as the rec market, like you said. And then you have the illegal market, which don't have programs. And so then you can fall in between, which could be a medical program or an area that's just decriminalized that where you get a civil penalty or a fine from it. So that is very interesting. Safira, I know you have a map because I know everyone's interested in knowing what states are legalized. Can you walk us through this?
Absolutely. And, when we look at the count, people divide the count between 34, 35 states that have programs that are, we'll call them medical programs. And what we've done on this map here is we've demonstrated the difference between where you have recreational cannabis, which there are now 16 because of New Jersey just enacting their program this week. The additional states, in addition to the dark green, you have your medical cannabis programs. And then you'll see kind of as you go down the color chart there, there are states that are lighter in color, so lighter white there. Those are medical programs that have really restricted usage. So those would be states that only allow for certain types of disease classes or qualifying conditions to be able to access cannabis as a therapeutic treatment. And then you have Idaho and Nebraska that have no access to cannabis. And we put in the red just so people know where there is pending momentum towards legislation. One of the things I think is really important to say is, even though you and I are talking about what's possible and feasible, we're not giving legal advice here. And so people really need to consult with their local laws and their local law enforcement and local counsel before they do anything, because we wouldn't want people to listen to this and think that we're somehow giving them legal counsel. And the other thing we want to make sure that folks know about cannabis and the legality of it is just because if you can purchase legally in one state doesn't mean you can transport it across state lines. That is a big no-no, and that is going to trigger a violation of federal law where cannabis remains illegal.
So, Safira, let me understand this. Can you explain to me what's the difference between state laws and federal laws?
Right. So, we live in a country where we have two levels of laws that affect us in our everyday lives and everything we do. And the overarching federal law really has superseding power because of the way our country was formed. The states have the power to enact laws, and they have enacted cannabis laws. And this has created a very confusing conflict, not just for ordinary citizens who want to know if they can access cannabis for therapeutic purposes, but businesses are struggling. Paying your taxes is a struggle, getting a bank account. So this conflict between federal and state law is really the source of all of the problems associated with the future of cannabis in our country. And that is what we're working so hard to resolve.
That's so interesting. So for me, I would have to make it just a little more practical to understand. I know during tax time, I have to pay state taxes and federal taxes. I have to answer to both. And that's pretty much what we're saying here. It sounds like that we have to answer to both. We have to answer to what is the lay of the land for the state level, but also federally, what is the lay of the land and how it impacts the patient at the end of the day.
Right. I think that's a great way to describe it. I'd say one other thing also kind of before we go on is that, even though cannabis is still illegal federally, there are special laws in place, particularly and specifically in states that have medical programs where the federal government is not going to prosecute and not going to enforce. And that's actually the law. The federal government, because of special, very nuanced laws associated with the way the government spends its money, is it won't prosecute in states where medical is allowed. But that same protection that is afforded to states for medical is not afforded to states for recreational. So if you live in a state that is allowed recreational, you don't have to worry about your state law, but you don't have the protections federally. Now, I should say, we haven't seen any, as I call, descending of the black helicopters. So the federal government has really exercised a policy of permissiveness. It's not enforcing the laws in states where there are legal cannabis. And that's really where we are headed for, that is where we are headed. I'll just say this, I'm gonna say for the future, that is where we are headed. That is where we're headed toward legalization.
Well, I think also like we're looking at trends that you can see legalization happen. We see 34 states trending towards 50. We see the whole topic of reciprocity coming into play. We see how patients are demanding the medicine day to day. When do you think it will be actually legalized federally?
If I had a dollar for every time everyone asked me that, you know, the timing and the temperament of federal legalization actually turns on some broader questions. I will say, and if you look at the recent polling, I mean, cannabis legalization is more popular than water in red and blue states. But politically, it's very complicated. And it's complicated because, the failed war on drugs and policies of discriminatory treatment by communities of color, that has to be addressed. And we can't just legalize cannabis without acknowledging and repairing the gross harms and injustices to humans and families and the future of these populations. And so that's where it gets complicated, Dr. Macias. I mean, it's happening, but it's really impacting how quickly it happens.
Definitely. And I think sensible laws, cannabis laws are important. So if we have to make it a step by step progression to get ultimately what we want, but make sure we're inclusive in that narrative, it's really important, especially from my community, which is definitely diversified. And we want to make sure that that pipeline that we've seen a patient become a prisoner and have that legislation reform so that everyone has equal access to the medicine. And I
Right.
think that's what we're kind of talking about here. And I know there is legislation currently on the table. Can you talk about what is out there right now?
So the comprehensive legislation that the entire industry is, and not just the entire industry, but the entire country, the entire movement towards legalization is really excited about is called the MORE Act. And the MORE Act is as a piece of legislation that would deschedule cannabis. It would remove cannabis from its current status on the Controlled Substances Act, where it sits next to very dangerous drugs that it has no reason sitting next to those drugs, and so it would deschedule cannabis, but it would also um, address those corrections that we discussed, which is it would expunge people's records if they were imprisoned or they had a criminal record because of cannabis. It would actually help direct money towards communities to help repair those communities, and it would actually direct opportunity for Black and brown entrepreneurs to be able to take advantage to what is now becoming the fastest, or is the fastest growing industry in our country today. That piece of legislation passed out of the House last December. And every time we get a new Congress, we have to reintroduce legislation. We recently had an amazing meeting with leader Chuck Schumer, who joined Senator Craig Gardner from New Jersey and Senator Wyden from Oregon. And the three of them are going to work together to advance comprehensive cannabis reform. And when you have the leader of the Senate ready to advance something meaningful, you know it's going to get momentum. That is we'll call it an all-encompassing approach. So we're trying to accomplish a lot in one bill. The elasticity within the conversation, meaning the more narrow conservative approach, is something we call incremental reform. And incremental reform would say that we can't solve everything, so let's solve something. And so there's a piece of legislation that would at least allow businesses who are regulated in the industry, in the cannabis industry, to access bank accounts. And that also means that if Black and brown business owners want to take advantage of the industry, they could get loans. And so it's a really important piece for our social equity applicants and people who are looking to get licenses who are new to business and new to cannabis. And so those two pieces of legislation, the incremental versus the comprehensive, is where we are really working our hardest in Capitol Hill.
Yeah, definitely. I know I work very hard on that, pushing those narratives as well to represent my community, to make sure we have a voice present from there. But also, Safira, what I see with my patients day to day, they have practical questions where they don't have a place to go to get the answers. I'm gonna throw out a couple of them and just discuss them here so
Sure.
that we share the education. One of the things that people ask me is that, can I consume cannabis in public? And I talk about, what is legal and what's not legal. That would be something on the state level where most programs have you consuming cannabis within your homes.
Right.
Um, and so, not to say that California or other states haven't legalized consumption lounges, but that is something, again, that's a state to state
Right.
narrative. And so, I want to make sure the patients are protected in
Mhm.
those conversations. But one of the things that falls through when I work with my patients that are federally subsidized in their housing and they're using something that is federally illegal, there has been times where I've had to go and, give expert opinion on saying that this is medication that they need for to sustain their livelihood. And with that, there's challenges federally because they're not allowed to use what is a federal classified substance in their homes.
Right. That's right. No, and I'm really glad that you brought up that distinction between if you are in an, if you're in a, whether you're on a federal park or you're in federal housing or you're anything where you're, we'll call it within, under the umbrella of the federal government, as opposed to not being umbrella of the federal government in your, in where you're living, where you're acting, where you're working. And because cannabis is federally legal there, it is still considered to be prohibited if you're a veteran, if you're federal student loans, and all of that is impacted because of the illegal status of cannabis federally. And so I'm really glad you made that distinction. It's an important one.
Well, Safira, it's just, my understanding of how these things work. And I think about patients, they ask me, they want to know, why are we still pushed back to the illicit market? And why is the illicit market so bad and so widespread? And I'm like, first of all, it's not a bad market. That's the market that got us here today. So, that needs to be, addressed as good or bad as it is, or your
Mhm.
perspective of that. But for me, is that the illicit market offers something to patients that the regulated market doesn't, which is open access. And so, until we have sensible cannabis policies and practices that help patients, we'll continue to see the illicit market to participate in this. Now, I'm not condoning one way or another, I'm just educating. So, with that, I know that my patient said some states don't have a medical cannabis that they use in the forms that they want to use. That's a reason why a patient will go to the illicit market. The other thing is really big, which is affordability. Um, because cannabis again is illegal, you can't use insurance for it,
That's
you
right.
healthcare insurance, and so the patients again have to pay out of pocket.
Right.
And the illicit market allows for that free access, where with medical programs you do have to have a doctor's recommendation, and you have to go in and purchase medicine, which could be a lot more expensive than in the illicit market. So I think, the reason I'm having this conversation about the different forms or open access for patients is because until we think about legalization for everyone to give
Right.
everyone access, we're going to still have to address the issues of the illicit market and of unregulated market. And what I do appreciate about the regulated market is that there is some type of standardized testing with it. And not, again, to say that one is better, but one is regulated and the other one isn't. So I'm very mindful of giving patients the real information, because if they can't go to a credible source, where can they go? So, again, these are the realities. And when I think about opioid usage, where the pharmaceutical companies have definitely given open access to opioids to everyone across the nation. And as we see the rise in accidentally overdoses continue right now during COVID-19, it's alarming that these medical programs or even the states are not finding for a safer alternative, which would be medical cannabis. And so, when we think about legalization, I want to make sure that, when we go to Capitol Hill and we're fighting these battles, that we're fighting for the patient. We're fighting for their voice in this, to be able to use their credit cards, their debit cards, their healthcare insurance, healthcare spending plans, because it's truly a medicine that they need to have access to. And I think that, the work and the narrative that you're creating through our collective voices with National Cannabis Roundtable has been very imperative to pushing that narrative. But what else, Safira, do you think we can do as a community to get our point across?
I think the first thing is exactly what you're doing, which is to get educated. The reason that we are in the position we are now to even advance legalization is because the laboratories of democracy, which have come about state by state, because the people in these states have demanded access to this medicine, because the legislation, whether it be by constitutional amendment or a vote by legislature, it is via the state, it's via the patients, it's via the consumers that we are, this green wave has basically, taken off, and at a momentum that I think everybody's amazed by. And so I think consumers staying both educated and diligent. And then I'm going to again use kind of a little bit of may seem a little, but we've got to be patient that the legalization is not going to happen imminently. It's going to likely happen in phases. And so while it's happening, continue to stay informed, continue to stay activated, and continue to be a part of the conversation, instead of kind of thinking, well, if it didn't happen this way and my way and right now, then I'm done with it. It's only through this kind of diligent and consistent effort that we've seen a change in administration, that we've seen a change in politics, that we've seen a change in priorities. And it's through this that we will really see the change in policy. So I really thank you for your leadership. And I thank your patience and the individuals who look to you for thought leadership. That's where we're going to initiate change. And that's what's going to help us direct the change in the direction that communities, patients, and consumers demand and deserve.
Definitely. Safira, I'm going to pivot. We have a couple of minutes to some of the questions, and I'm going to take a first stab at them. One thing that I have my patients ask about is that if I am legally enrolled in a medical cannabis program and my employer tests me and I have permission to use it through my doctor and through the state, can I lose my employment? And the real issue behind that is that it depends on your employer's policy about cannabis. I've had many workshops with different employers to educate them on how patients use cannabis and to help them make decisions around sensible policy for employment. But that is something that can have an impact. There
Absolutely.
are some states that have passed some protections for people using or patients using medical cannabis. Some of them haven't. So, again, bringing awareness and using this platform as a place that we can log in these questions and bring them and ask for federal, changes to be implemented and to really bring awareness to what the patient's voice looks like is what I'm looking to do through this series of different virtual classrooms. Um, we will also have a segment based on the question here about the veterans. We think about our veteran population that is not being supported currently the way that we believe as patients to support veterans impacted by different ailments and conditions, including PTSD. The suicide rates with our veterans is just unbelievable, and not to have any type of national attention to help tackle these questions is really it's hard for us. I see my veteran population. I support them with different ways. Um, Even discount programs to help subsidize the medicine. But the VA hospital currently will not recommend cannabis or cannabis usage for our veterans. And sometimes we even see a more serious impact on their benefits when they have revealed that they are using cannabis. So this is, some of the information that I have that I'm just trying to be transparent and create this dialogue so everyone's aware of our obstacles, and what we have to overcome. And I think that bringing awareness, sharing this live session, please do, so that we can bring that awareness and spread it out so that we can make sure everyone's thoughts and hearts are reflected when we go to Capitol Hill and fight for federal, and when we're in our home states, that people know about the medical programs, the recreational programs, if you'll say, or adult use or legal programs. But what rights do the patients have with that? I think that it's really important. And patients that are not currently being supported by the medical program should still have a doctor to recommend them for their added protection as well. I think I go back to the patient, the patient, the patient. And we have to make sure all protections are necessary. So, I'm gonna give a good idea of what I also mean by that. Is that in the state of Louisiana, for example, we have some areas are decriminalized and some places are criminalized. So if you have a medical card, it gives you that protection. Where if you are in the decriminalized area, then you're used a civil penalty for possession up to a certain amount, and you would have to look at what that amount is and to know that. But again, we need to start to spread the awareness between the difference of being in a medical program and having certain protections versus not being in a medical program where it's still criminalized because you can still be incarcerated. So these are the things that we're bringing forward. We want you to talk about more, and definitely what we can do to help express your voice in the national sense. So I know we're tapping out of time, but I thank you for joining me today in this conversation about legalization. Again, 34 states are legal. Reciprocity are in states like locations like Washington, D.C., where they'll see other states, the other 34 states in Washington, D.C., as long as you have your medical card. Again, sensible policy. We've seen more states come on board with different conditions and ailments open so you can get your medical card for any ailment. Also, what we see is more physicians enrolling in the program. So again, thank you for joining us today. Please leave your comments and questions below. We'll try to address them in either by writing back or having another topic about this discussion. God bless you all. Bye.
Thanks, Shonda. Thanks, everyone.